We're discussing the quadrilateral security dialogue, or the Quad, where it is and where it's going. This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi. Our expert today joins us from Australia, Admiral Sudarshan Shrikhande, a well-known analyst on our channel and elsewhere, of course. He is a senior research fellow currently at the University of Wollongong's Australian National Centre for Ocean Resources and Security, that's ANCORS. And of course, has been a former Director of Naval Intelligence in the Indian Navy. Admiral Shrikhande, thanks so much for your time, sir.
Thank you, Amitabh. Very happy to join you from down under.
Admiral, just looking at the latest buzz that we are hearing now, of course, India reportedly tried to hold the Quad Leaders Summit in and around the Republic Day. That didn't happen. There is a buzz currently that it could possibly be held during the UNGA Summit for Future, during that period. Prime Minister Modi has also had phone calls with both his Australian counterparts and President Biden after his return from the UK. In terms of Leaders Summit, and if it happens now, what are your thoughts, Admiral?
Well, I think a Leaders Summit, the Heads of Government Summit is overdue now, and it just might happen during the UN as an additional activity. Such meetings have taken place on the sidelines of something else earlier also. So it is possible, but I also haven't seen anything in the media which says it might be.
Again, while it's not officially positioned, the Quad that is against China, we know who the elephant in the room is. But walk us through the language, Admiral, that is now par for the course, say, in the joint statements that come through, whether it's foreign ministerial level or leaders level. Even if there is no specific mention of the CCP, there is mention of the Chinese aggression in various areas.
Yes, you're right. The current communique that is on the 29th of July does go further than the previous foreign minister's statements and the previous statements coming up from the Leaders Summit, which was in 2022. So there has been some additional mention. It is true that the communique does not use the word China, other than in South China Sea and East China Sea, but it calls out for what the maritime militia are doing, the worries about their coast guard, etc. Now, this also has to be seen in a couple of ways. One is that each of the member nations, in its own different fora and different occasions, has flagged concerns about China as adversarial, as a problem in many ways. Even as trade with China continues, negotiations continue between all the partners, and high-level meetings have been taking place. That doesn't reduce the adversarial concerns that China raises bilaterally or individually with each of the four Quad members, and collectively now this is reflecting more and more in the communiques coming out of the Quad, and in fact the measures that the Quad is taking. However, having said that, the Quad is far more than being about China. Although China has been, as I've said somewhere, the trigger as well as the glue for the Quad really to create many of the initiatives which seek to provide public goods on a much larger canvas, on the canvas of the entire Indo-Pacific itself. So China is, as you mentioned, to use the cliche, the elephant in the room, and the Quad is a counterpoise to many of the concerns that China raises.
Again, Admiral, if you just want to look at the evolution of it was a time, as you pointed out when we were talking earlier, that there was no joint statement, but the evolution of the joint statements as they have progressed.
Yes, in fact, the joint statements are getting, if one could use the term, more robust. They are getting more specific, and they have now greater and greater steps and roadmap content that point out to various initiatives across a whole lot of activities, as you would have seen, across infrastructure, across cable network security, space security, and of course, within the maritime dimension itself. Now, when it comes to the maritime dimension, one would say that whenever we talk now of the maritime commons, as the Quad does, the two other commons are also coming in, which is, of course, the cyber commons and the space commons, and all of them are related. So when the foreign ministers talk so vehemently and strongly and unequivocally, I would say one of the major agendas of the Quad is to maintain freedom of the Indo-Pacific. And what would we mean by that? It would mean the four Quad countries coming together to provide one of the biggest public goods that can be provided across the Indo-Pacific is the freedom of the Indo-Pacific itself. In all the three commons, that is the maritime commons, the cyber common, and the space commons. Now, if we look at just trade itself, freedom of the Indo-Pacific is, of course, the freedom to trade without some of the problems as have been flagged for the South China Sea, East China Sea, the the indication that it is China which is not adhering to many provisions of the UNCLOS itself, the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, uh, the belligerent actions along the maritime neighbors, and as our foreign minister has said, uh, India has all the China concerns that others have, and yet we have some more concerns. And those are the continental concerns, certainly what is happening, what has happened across the Himalayan borders, and what we are doing to prevent any further activities there that are inimical to us by taking a strong stand uh, on along the borders itself. But having said that, on the maritime commons, maritime trade has, of course, physical components in terms of ships, etc., but it has a big digital component, which means that much of the digital trade, the services trade that we often refer to, actually flows over cables that run, at the bottom of the sea. And there are 1.5 million kilometers of cables. A large part of that services all nations across the Indo-Pacific itself, China included, Taiwan included. All of us are in it, and therefore the initiatives for all these three commons are really important. And this is something that I imagine members of the ASEAN, members of the Pacific Island Forum, etc., all welcome. And in fact, both these forums have been mentioned within the Quad communique itself, as indeed they were in the 2022 Leaders Summit communique, but this time in more clear, precise terms.
Admiral, even though you said China is not the only reason for the Quad, there are many analysts, including you, who agree with the fact that if there was no China, there would be no Quad. And China is worried, we can see from its reactions, about the traction that the Quad is getting.
Yes, indeed. I think organizations like the United Nations or the Quad itself come up, to solve a problem. If there is no problem, then of course, in a frivolous manner, one can say that there is no need for a solution itself. So if there's no question to be answered, then there's no requirement for an answer. So yes, you're right. I agree with you that Quad, is a counterpoise, as I mentioned, to China. So take China away, and the public goods might still be required, but to a lesser degree. The freedom of the Indo-Pacific is the biggest concern today to the freedom of the Indo-Pacific remains China.
And in terms of the Quad, would you would you agree with the view that the political leadership in India is keenly bought into the idea, and there may be other elements of the administration which may be a little hesitant about it?
It may be so. If you see, the prime minister's statements and the statements of the other leaders, as well as the foreign minister's statements, I think the Quad is very much front and center in their thoughts. Now, yes, you're right. It is true that many other capitals, China, sometimes Moscow, also have voiced their apprehensions about Quad, it being an Asian NATO, etc. But I think that simply isn't true. Quad need not be an Asian NATO, and the security part of the quadrilateral security dialogue is important. And there may be some skeptics within the Indian system about the Quad itself, but I think though their numbers are reducing as the value of the Quad as a big agency that can provide public goods across the Indo-Pacific is increasing. And I think, as I mentioned, Quad itself need not become inclusive in its membership because it is so inclusive in its agenda and in what it can provide others. So that is the biggest USP of the Quad. We don't need more members in the Quad. I think the four forming the Quad itself, quite literally, is sufficient. And if in our minds we imagine the quadrilateral itself, the sizes of each side can change according to what each nation brings to sort out one segment of the problems. And indeed, in some ways, some lead nations have been designated or uh, mutually agreed to within the Quad, somebody to look after cyber, somebody to look after HADR, and coordinate those aspects. So it has versatility, flexibility, elasticity, and it provides a high measure of security, that is human security.
You
So
mentioned
certainly, China, uh, in its wisdom, keeps raising concerns that the Quad is anti-China. But there is no need for any of the leaders of the Quad, ministers or diplomats, to really, call it anti-China or something. It is, I think, pro Indo-Pacific rather than being anti-China. And just to reiterate. Uh, Absent China's activities that raise concern, then certainly the Quad won't be required.
You mentioned it a couple of times already, Admiral, but if you want to just in depth talk about what is common among the four partners in the quadrilateral in terms of the commons, the three or four commons that you have analyzed a lot.
Okay, I think all nations have uh, a reasonable middle or great power size. The US could be a great power. All the other three are middle powers of varying capacities economically, but all are economically, strong. They all are democracies, and they are providing public goods, without regard to the nature of governments within the region. And vastly, the Indo-Pacific is a democratic region. The exceptions are as we know, very very few. China being one of them, but nonetheless, the other things that are common is that in many ways, therefore, the term that is applied, maritime democracies, applies to all four. Uh, Australia and Japan are, of course, literally island nations, or in the case of Australia, an island continent that has one coast on the Pacific and one coast on the Indian Ocean itself. India is in many ways has severe continental problems to resolve, but is also a maritime nation in quite in almost a literal way now, with the peninsula and with our increasing trade, and the fact that maritime trade services that flow across the maritime commons and our interest in cybersecurity and space security make a lot of these things common within all the four Quad members. Plus,
Again, 2 points that
we have been exercising. I may add that even before the advent of Quad, India and the US have been doing a lot of security cooperation, a lot of exercises. The Malabar series being one of them, and after that, uh, Japan and Australia have also been active participants in the Malabar exercises, which are often referred to as Quad exercises. But I think the label of Malabar is adequate because that label precedes, the use of the term Quad itself. So it is a coincidence, and sometimes more than a coincidence, that the Quad and the Malabar participants are the same, and across a range of security activities, defense security activities, we are cooperating for, I guess, the larger public good.
I'll just come to the Malabar exercises a little later, but as you pointed out, for all the four nations, and I think even Singapore at one point of time was part of the exercises where the Prime Minister's next visit, he's visiting there as well after Brunei. But the 2 points that you raised earlier, if you want to flesh them out, One, in terms of the fact that there may not be a necessity to expand the Quad. Quad Plus has been talked about, Quad 2 Plus has been talked about. Why that is so? And two, even though you mentioned that the US is the greater global power and the others are middle powers, it doesn't give the US primacy in the Quad as such.
Yes. So, you look at the US part, the within the Quad, certainly, the US can be considered a great power, and all the other three are middle powers, as I mentioned, of different capacities and capabilities and different levels of economic and international diplomatic influence. And nonetheless, all are sort of equal. All are pulling their weight, and sometimes pulling more than their weight. The issue with the US is that the US is not sort of physically located in the region, although it has great interests in the region, whereas Japan, Australia, and India are physically located. And India, amongst these three, India becomes the largest country, the most populous country, and in time, I think, will become, other than the US and China, the largest economy within the Quad itself. So, as I think the foreign minister said the other day, somewhere in some interaction with Economic Times, I'm not too sure, but I heard that he said that with as India is growing, we'll need to step up to the plate and shoulder greater responsibilities towards collective well-being and collective security, mainly human security. But uh, deterring inimical forces becomes perhaps the best way of ensuring human security.
And again, as you pointed out earlier, in terms of Quad is not an Asian NATO, but is there need as we go down the line for some kind of formalization of structure? Because it's neither is it the SEO nor is it the BRICS.
Uh, yes, I imagine with so many working groups like the Maritime Security Working Group, the Cyber Working Group. Then there are groups that are working on climate change, on medicines, on infrastructure build-up. I imagine that sooner or later, some kind of a core secretariat will be required, which could be a mobile secretariat, which could be a permanent secretariat. Now, setting up secretariats takes a long time. It requires resourcing, but it also requires, greater acceptance everywhere. And it remains to be seen how that happens. But the Quad, is quite rightly still a dialogue, unlike the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or the United Nations Organization or the NATO, etc. It is still fuzzy, and within that fuzziness, I think lie some advantages of Quad, which increase its appeal. So the Quad, as you mentioned, already, is certainly not an Asian NATO. It has no interest in being an Asian NATO, and I think ASEAN, the Pacific Island nations, and others around the periphery within the Indian Ocean, I think well recognize that it is not an Asian NATO. It need not be and never will be an Asian NATO. On the other hand, the Quad, I think, in many ways is like a mirror of how the Marshall Plan, or the I think the European Recovery Act, as it was properly called, began in 1948, and it seeks to now improve infrastructure, help revival, and all done in a far more transparent, acceptable way to those it also seeks to benefit. And many of the benefits that the Quad is seeking are also centered around the four members of the Quad itself. So, improvements in human security, improvements in cyber security, improvements in freedom of the Indo-Pacific do help the region, but they also help each individual member of the Quad. And the good part, I think, about the Quad, if I could put it that way, is to look at the framework of the Quad, or the architecture of the Quad, as fundamentally consisting of six, fairly strong bilaterals. That is the bilaterals that each of the four members have with the other three. And it was because these bilaterals have gathered strength that the quadrilateral also benefits. So, in some ways, it might be right to suggest that the Quad feeds into the bilateral relationships, and the bilateral strengths of our relationships, that is, let's say India's relationship with the US, with Japan, and with Australia, in turn strengthen the Quad. And whatever now strengthens the Quad because of the larger initiatives that Quad now seeks to bring to the benefit of all nations across the Indo-Pacific, those who would like to derive those benefits, will gather acceptance. In fact, as you must be knowing, Indonesia has spoken. The Indonesian president has spoken favorably about the Quad. ASEAN is now speaking about the Quad, and the Pacific Island nations are looking at the Quad as an organization that will be of benefit to them. So they need not become members there. Many organizations which have expanded in membership actually can become unwieldy, and their effectiveness can start reducing. So I think for the moment, the Quad can literally remain just the Quad.
And as you pointed out, all these other countries without joining the Quad are still benefiting. But when you say mirror of the Marshall Plan, how good or bad is it as an alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative?
Yes, that's a very, very, very good question. In many ways, it is like the Belt and Road Initiative, but with greater transparency. The value that democracies of within the Quad bring, democracies have to be, transparent. They have to answer to their own people first, uh, and therefore there is an instinctive appeal about democracies that may seem at sometimes shaky to nations nearby, but I believe that even within the Indian Ocean region, our neighbors also are, I think, respectful, perhaps even sometimes envious when they themselves, have their democratic foundations shaken by economic setbacks or by change of regimes, etc. That India provides, a beacon of values of democracy, and so do all other three members of the Quad. So we have rule of law, which again, is mentioned within the communiques itself. We all four countries have legal systems that are valid, and I think the initiatives in terms of even the way aid assistance is given is far more gentler. It doesn't seek to somehow impress the leaders, but try and be in such a way that it benefits the people and the larger populations within those countries. So it's unlikely that any initiative of the Quad might become like a dead port or a dead airport or a highway that has no traffic or a railway that goes nowhere, or does really nothing for somebody apart from that creating a debt crisis in many countries. So I think many of the potential and current recipient nations of the aid, that say Japan and India or the US and Australia provided to many countries, quite apart from the Quad, uh, 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 carry these values of transparency, legal processes, good contracts, clear contracts that are acceptable and which will pass the litmus test of legality and correctness and fairness. Will all projects succeed? Possibly not, because sometimes projects fail because of circumstances beyond control, because of certain studies that were not carried out adequately. So coming back to the very important point you raised, BRI actually rushed in with money, and looked for reasons to spend it. Uh, the Quad, I think, is looking for ways to improve matters, and then try and see how to fund those matters in a mutually acceptable way.
Admiral, you mentioned earlier about Russia's hesitancy, I'm putting it diplomatically, about the Quad. In fact, Indo-Pacific is not a term they use, Asia-Pacific. But before we started this recording off air, you were talking about Indian foreign policy milestones. And in comparison to, say, the 1971 treaty between then Soviet Union and India Friendship Cooperation and the Quad, what are your thoughts?
Uh, yes, I do feel that the Quad is one of the biggest foreign policy steps that India has taken, along with, of course, obviously the other three members of the Quad. in some ways reminiscent of the 1971 treaty that you mentioned. So it is a huge step. Sometimes I don't think we realize it enough, how important the initial steps and the somewhat slow development of the Quad has been. But if we look at it between 2017 and now, the Quad has really taken, is really rolling, and it will bring those benefits surely if we stay the course and we resource the Quad initiatives properly. And that is happening in terms of the training that the Quad has started doing, in terms of the fellowships for cyber professionals, for infrastructure training, in the thousands that Quad is now funding, and that's quite amazing. Other than that, in terms of Moscow, not liking, well, I think we are able to handle those contradictions quite well, because we have a old relationship with Moscow, and statecraft is about handling contradictions. All nations have their contradictions in their statecraft, which may sometimes irk some other nations, and yet in the interest of all nations, not every interest of India is linked to the Quad's interest, and likewise, not every interest of Japan or Australia or the US, for that matter, is linked to India's or Quad's interest. So there will be occasional contradictions, some speed breakers, but uh, geographic connotations like Asia Pacific or Indo Pacific have had some years of now different interpretations. But if we look at it, the very names given to these oceans or these continents um, are in fact themselves so subjective. Uh, how does a line dividing one country between Asia and Europe, who made that line? Who decided this is Europe, this is Asia, or this is North America, and this is South America? So it really doesn't matter all that much. Although in the world of scholars, sometimes hair splitting can take place among such terms, and sometimes in the eyes and ears and uh, writings of even diplomats and political leaders. So I think we'll have to live with some of these.
Admiral Shrikhande, as usual, thank you from both your experience and your expertise that you're sharing with us and all our viewers on StratNews Global.
Thank you very much, Amitabh. Pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Pleasure's all ours, sir. And for our viewers, do send us feedback on this interview. You can see all the latest articles that we put up if you follow our social media handles on our website, and all interviews like this with Admiral Shrikhande on our YouTube channel. This is The Gist on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh.